So, greetings from Brooklyn. This is Progressive Enhancement with Modernizr. So, a little bit about me. I'm the technical director at Big Spaceship in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a Texas expatriate. I miss this state very much and managed to go to the fair yesterday, so I loaded up. The fried Thanksgiving dinner was ridiculous. It's like little donut balls of stuffing with just turkey and some jelly. It was awesome. I'm also the author of The Responsive Web, a book by Manning Publishing that should be out as soon as my publisher gets me to write more. That's also a picture from my honeymoon. I went to a tequila factory and got really into it, and they had this sombrero laying around, and I thought I'd be awesome. So there's a problem. There's a problem with the way we go about developing responsive websites, and that problem is that there aren't enough media queries. Media queries address a very specific need, right? If this is a tablet size, right, this is about the generic tablet width and height that you might see when you're talking about a responsive comp or something like that, when you have some creative work that's supposed to be responsive. And this is a mobile kind of size-ish. What is this? And what is this? These are the same sizes, but with the devices behind them. There is an actual device with actual capabilities behind these sizes. Media queries address the screen width and the fixed commodity, the most available unit of measurements for determining whether something is mobile or tablet or desktop, but it lacks a depth. It only addresses one available resource. Since it's the first non-negotiable, it's oftentimes the most addressed. And when we're often pushed against the timeline, it is the only thing addressed. But there's more to being device agnostic than simply the size of your screen. Like I said, there's a device behind these sizes, and those devices matter. So you have the width and the devices themselves and their capabilities. You also have a plethora of operating systems, each with their desktop and mobile variations. Each of those desktop and mobile operating systems have a set of browsers within them. Anybody who's running a web app or anything off of iOS 7 knows that iOS 7 with Safari, completely new ballgame. We just had a bunch of stuff go wrong on a beta that we were working on because of the way iOS 7 Safari deals with web apps. So the depth of things that can go, depth of variance between these configurations can lead to a lot more than just the screen width being the question, right? So you have features. You have a number of features, and their degrees of support and the type of stuff that they support is variant between browsers, OSs, devices. You've got all kinds of shit that you have to consider, and stuff that hasn't even happened yet. You've got all kinds of future shit down the road that you're going to have to worry about too. So typically we use things like hacks and fixes. We use polyfills to kind of force a bunch of stuff to happen in the browser and just get by, so that everything looks the same, right? Every mobile experience looks the same. Every tablet experience looks the same. Every desktop experience looks the same. And it's all just by cramming stuff in. And then we degrade to older browsers like IE8. The clock is ticking on IE8, and that's kind of the staple of old browser support to this point. That's fading away as all the A's have faded away pretty rapidly recently as devices are kind of upgrading and OSs are kind of getting antiquated. But this isn't necessarily all good news, because this means that a lot of users are going to be replacing IE8, and whether they move just directly to IE9 or pick up Firefox or pick up Chrome, there's going to be more variance there. The clock is also ticking on desktop computers. So tablets are picking up more and more of this slack from desktop computers, and what is actually being defined as a tablet is becoming more and more loose. Look at something like the Surface, which is essentially a laptop with a touch screen instead of a mouse. You have things like the Chrome Pixel, which is a laptop with a touch screen. So the lines are getting blurred between what is tablet, what is a laptop, what uses a mouse pointer, what uses a touch screen primarily as its input. Tablets are easier to use just because they do less, but they're inherently kind of crippled in some ways to afford more space, so they can be smaller, afford more battery space, but they are generally crippled. I think as Nathan brought up, iOS has a huge latency problem with JavaScript. So more and more these tablets are kind of crippled, but the market's diversifying in the actual devices themselves. The other problem is that the third world is coming online, and shit is real. Like, they hold on to devices. When in America, we have this kind of view of upgrading our phone as like a $200 price point. We do it every 2 years. We're in a cycle. So you gotta go iPhone to iPhone to iPhone to iPhone every couple of years. In the third world, they don't have these subsidized phones. So an iPhone costs $1,000. You spend $1,000 on something, you want it to last more than 2 years, right? So they hold on to their devices longer. Like, I just got back from Mexico, and a lot of the cars on the street there, the people who are actually driving, are still from the 80s and 90s because their economies force them to kind of hold on and make things last. As the third world picks up on mobile devices, not that Mexico is necessarily the third world, but they're going to be holding on to these things longer and longer. All of this means that diversity is going to happen more and more. The capabilities of the devices and the phone and the browsers is going to get a wider and wider spread over time. So the solution to this is progressive enhancement. Now, progressive enhancement to me is to improve a site starting from the smallest subset of supported features and then moving outward. One thing I want to kind of get off the bat, like right away, progressive enhancement doesn't necessarily mean we start with like IE7 on an old computer and then enhance. An enhancement can mean anything from enhancing to new, more modern systems to enhancing support for older, antiquated systems. The term enhancement kind of like naturally asks us to think about like improving, but sometimes an improvement is support for an older thing, something that might not be the initial goal of the product. A progressive enhancement workflow that I've kind of found to work, that we've been using a lot lately at Big Spaceship, is this kind of base to build to test to enhance. And the test and enhance, you kind of cycle through those, but we'll get into that later. A base, you identify a starting point. From there, you build to the specifications built by the starting point. You test on those specifications, and you enhance the work. Now, this test and enhance cycle here can happen pretty rapidly, and doesn't necessarily mean you build out everything and then you go into enhancing. A lot of times you build like one piece or one module, one page, one screen, and then enhance that one. But generally, we kind of hit this rhythm. So we're going to start with a base. This is a kind of starting point that we identify. You work it out with your clients and find out what works for them. You start with this base for your initial prototype. So this is identifying like how we're going to view this internally on our first go around, how we're going to kind of build first, and then where we're going to go from there. At this point, like when you're building stuff, everything is a prototype. And internally in our nomenclature, we talk about everything as a prototype until it's actually live. Nothing is actual, nothing is out of the prototype phase, out of beta, until it's on a live server and we're driving real traffic to it. Some examples of some starting points: a JavaScript-disabled handheld device, desktop computer running IE8, a touch screen for the visually impaired, a JavaScript-enabled laptop, a tablet with crappy Wi-Fi, a drunk circus clown with Google Glass, an angry cowboy wearing a smartwatch. You can start it anywhere. Just define who your target is and try to figure out what they might be using. That's the starting point you want to go with. You also want to kind of build in a little bit of like some limitations. For instance, we started with something that was kind of advanced in the browser set, but with a mobile first for the content and layout. So we built in those enhancements on layout to give us something to kind of cripple it back a little bit in the amount of width we used, and then expand out from there. So let the business define your starting point. I can't really define that for you. That dude over there is not going to be able to define it for you. And some dude's Tumblr isn't going to be able to define it for you. Don't let outside influence affect what your starting point is. Your starting point is defined by your business, by your client's needs, and by your own internal goals. For us, we had some bandwidth goals that we set, some device goals, some browser goals, but those were all defined by what the business was currently doing, by an audit of their analytics, and what their users were looking for, and we built out from there. In this case, it wasn't necessarily IE, it was Chrome. Strategy and UX groups should be providing you with user stories, and you can derive your starting point from these. So like I said, come up with some data, and then figure out where your biggest subset of traffic is coming from. For us, like I said, we started with mobile, we started with OS X, and we started with Chrome. This was what we defined as our ideal starting point. Now, obviously, this doesn't exist in the real world. In the real world, you might see something like mobile iOS with Chrome or Safari. This is a very small subset of their actual traffic, but it represented ideas that were necessary in the bigger goal, the bigger objective. Most of their users were coming through with Chrome. We were building a site that wouldn't be launched for another year. So we had identified Chrome as the one that has the biggest ramp up, the biggest adoption rate among their user base. Same thing with OS X. We identified that as the biggest adoption rate. And we started with mobile because we wanted mobile first design. So these sort of things established our starting point. From there, we went into the build process. Again, like I said, everything's a prototype until it's actually live. So this is very much like a prototype phase. When we talk to the client, we always identify Chrome-ready prototypes. We're displaying Chrome-ready prototypes to reinforce that the client should be looking at these in Chrome. We ask them to kind of like download Chrome if they don't already have it. And at least if we force Chrome, we can identify the browser. So it takes a lot of the question work out of like what they might be seeing. Because then the only variable really is whether it's Windows or Mac. And those are kind of within a margin of the sameness that it was easy to kind of work through. From there, we test. And there's simulated testing, and there's a need for simulated testing, obviously. We identify simulated environments early on, and then build out from there. In the development process, we'll work with simulated environments to keep things going, but everything we do, we test in a real-world environment. We take it outside of the office with us. We make sure it's accessible, and we want to like really get into it. So we test here. I go to the DMV and I bring it up on my phone. This is somewhere where I might actually, since it's an e-commerce site, I might actually be shopping while I'm sitting in line at the DMV. I test here. I go use my phone in the bathroom a lot. I test there. I test here. On Sunday mornings, I'm watching football. I bring it up on my laptop to make sure that I can actually be distracted and navigate the site. Especially with e-commerce, you have a lot of users coming in who are shopping as a secondary thing. They're doing the kind of second screen experience that we see a lot. So it's important to actually test against distraction as a variable that you consider. From there, we improve. So we enhance along the way. Like I said earlier, sometimes an enhancement is support for an older system. Sometimes enhancements is support for IE7. So we start with our starting point, like I said, and then we start doing enhancements for different devices, OSs, and browsers. Through each cycle, we take our simulated environments, which represent subsets of these combinations, and we test through those. We try to get a hold of real devices and a device suite for the project that can give us enough simulated environments where we can cover as many edge cases as possible. You test, you enhance. These were animated GIFs, and they were hilarious, but yeah, they're not working, so let's just pretend they're awesome. Test, enhance. He was going to give like a thumbs up. I was actually really proud of that one. Test and enhance. That's supposed to spin. It was cute. In order to do this, we need a tool that could appropriate what CSS and JavaScript could be loaded for which users. So each test is reflected by some assets that need to be available for users, right? Like Chris kind of brought up, like if you simply test and just lump everything into like site.js, site.css, all you're really doing is escalating a potential problem. So we need some way to distinguish tests and their successes and failures. If you have been paying attention, obviously the test is Modernizr. That's the tool that we're using here to fix these problems. So Modernizr is a JavaScript library that detects HTML5 and CSS features in the user's browser. How many people are familiar with Modernizr or use it on a regular basis? So you guys are pretty brushed up on it. We detect features and not browsers themselves, because features change. Features adjust, support for them adjusts. Features are adopted, browsers change. Browsers are a continually moving thing. And you simply link the script, link Modernizr in your head tag, add a class of Node.js to your HTML, and you're ready to go with the base Modernizr experience. which is on load, Modernizr simply adds a set of classes against the HTML tag for you to select features against. So you can augment your CSS to meet the needs of the tests and whether they pass and fail. So you have, for instance, Canvas. If Canvas wasn't supported, the class would be no-canvas, right? So you have this higher level selector that you can apply to elements to determine their support. Because it's on the HTML class, it's the highest, most valuable selector, so it can override anything on the page. So if we had this sidebar that had an SVG in it, we had an SVG fallback and an SVG enabled version, we could use these selectors to target that sidebar and override whatever the default is based on the support for SVGs in the browser. There's about 40 tests out of the box. They cover all the like CSS3 and HTML5 features that you might think of when you think of what you'd want to test against. They're pretty common staples of the current set of features, but it's kind of limiting. You want to kind of add and subtract these features depending on your site, and the out-of-the-box stuff is kind of, it's nice. It's nice to have, and changing the CSS, like I said before, is handy, but it adds bloat. What we need is something a little bit more useful, and the Modernizr add test method adds that. So it's kind of like Voltron. You can slap anything onto this guy and improve Modernizr and add some new feature to Modernizr to make it do a little bit more. For instance, on something we're working on now, we wanted to test whether or not the user was logged in. So what we did was I'd set a local storage Boolean value of true or false, and then I would do a Modernizr test to see if somebody's logged in. And this gave me a really simple way to test whether or not a user was logged into the site or not in our templates, and we could adjust appropriately. So we have some logged in assets that we want to make prioritized, and we have some non-logged in assets. It gave me the HTML class to override the current selectors so I could change colors of buttons, prioritize things based on whether or not someone is logged in or not. There's better ways to do this, but with the local storage session and prototypes, it just kind of worked really nicely. So we have a non-logged in and a logged in version of the sidebar where different things are shown and hidden and what have you. CSS feature detection is great, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. You can do a lot more with this. Say, for instance, we had a conference in Dallas, Texas, and we wanted to offer a discount to all locals. You could add a geofence around Dallas, add some geolocation variables in, and return true or false on whether or not the user is visiting from Dallas. And then you could give them different buttons, different subsets, different ways of promoting the site based on their geolocation, right? For instance, you might not want airfare or like travel arrangements to be displayed and waste that screen real estate for travel arrangements on somebody who's already in Dallas, right, for this conference. So you could detect whether or not somebody's in Dallas, return a true or false on that, and then load in completely new assets depending on their location. The depth of what you can actually do with Modernizr once you get into ad test is really astounding. You get a responsive experience based on where the user is. You could do things like track their movement, whether or not they're in movement. So you might want to change button size if somebody's actually in movement versus if they're in a static environment by weighing against the accelerometer. If the accelerometer is moving rapidly, somebody's in movement, increase button size. These are kind of responsive tests that you can apply against the site by simply adding tests into Modernizr. The other cool feature of Modernizr is the Modernizr.load. Now this gives us the ability to asynchronously load in assets and change things after the initial page load. It's really handy, and we'll get into it. It allows you to load files only when they're required. Has anyone seen the movie Labyrinth? You know, the like crazy junk lady in the movie that terrified me as a child? You know, she's like got this like bunch of stuff on her back, and she's just kind of like collecting things she might need at some point in the future, and she's got this huge burden of stuff she carries with her. A lot of times our sites end up like that. We have this thing that we might need later, or that might not be important now, but we want to include it so it's cached. A lot of times these things pile up and escalate and turn our sites into the junk lady who's just carrying around a bunch of baggage. So one solve that we found for this is that we could assign like an event to load in new assets. So for instance, we have a plugin that we build for date picking, and it's hidden under a mouse enter event. So you hover over the component that you need to fire off the piece where the date picker is hidden, and then we load in that plugin. Most users might not even need this plugin. They might not even need the date picker at all in their experience. So we don't burden with them with that asset on the initial page load. We wait until they actually need it and then load it in. You can also load files based on Modernizr tests. So this is something like for polyfills and things like that. You might see that Flexbox isn't enabled, so you want to load in a different CSS file for no Flexbox. This is as easy as this. It uses yep, nope. You run the test initially. Based on what it loads, you can assign a touch JavaScript or a no touch JavaScript, and then you can just go bind things on the callback as opposed to simply just throwing it all in there or doing it initially and just loading in fallbacks. You can test and then build in different assets based on those tests. You also have Modernizr MQ. I got a little bored with the background images and just started like grabbing random stuff at this point. So Modernizr.mq works like CSS media queries. They're identical in their syntax. It allows you to kind of pair what Modernizr is doing with what your media queries might be doing out of the box. So what you can do is set, like I said, the exact same syntax. You identify a breakpoint at which you want to load in different assets and set this Modernizr test. So in this example, we have a couple tests that are paired. We have Modernizr.touch and this media query. There wasn't enough room to put in a whole media query, so I just put X. But if it passes both of these tests now, you get the touch.js or the no touch.js if it fails. So in this case, we've tested if touch is available, and we're also below, say, a certain breakpoint. Now we load in all these touch assets. If we're above that breakpoint and we fail either one of these tests, then we load in the no touch assets. So again, it's just more diversity that you can bring to your sites based on actual user data. So let's put all this together into an example. Like I said, you can gradually improve a site from a starting point. So this is my starting point. This is a demo site that we have. This is an example of some artwork that I might be given by a designer. And obviously it's kind of a desktop width. You've got like a 5-up product array and a background image. I would take this and build this out as a mobile experience. So I'd start at this point for my starting point. I might then use a Modernizr load call to test against a couple features. So we test against whether touch is enabled, or in this case, if touch is not available. And then we test against a media query. We load in a parallaxing dock, which does a cool little effect, and a hover, and some CSS to accompany that. And then if it fails, we have the touch version to come in and do like all the touch screen interactions, so you can do little swipes or what have you. So we take that desktop experience, we translate that into a mobile experience. We then add in Modernizr load to pull in all the assets that we need to improve it, and we blow it up to the desktop. And at this point, like, the desktop users have been served all the JavaScript and CSS that they need for their experience. The mobile users have only gotten the stuff that they need for their experience. The entire site is loaded asynchronously, so there's no crossover. There's no extra data that's being transferred. There's no extra requests. It's just what you need for your device at that time. So again, we start with a starting point, and we expand out. Each one of these accompanying a set of tests that accomplish the goals of those browsers, those operating systems, and those devices. So progressive enhancement is a pretty slow process. It's time-consuming. It takes a lot of foresight. It requires you to be to dive into some data ahead of time and set off that build process, set off the actual making, and do that over a longer span of time. But it affords you the opportunity to make a product that you can be really proud of that is optimized. A lot of people talk about progressive enhancement, but they don't offer ways to actually do it or a practical workflow. They just say, like, we need to make sure that such and such browser is supported, such and such experience is supported, such and such user is important, and if you don't acknowledge these people, you're kind of telling them to screw off. That's true-ish, but simply compromising the total experience of a site in an effort to appease subsets of people gives everyone a bad experience, right? Pulling in what you need for who needs it gives everyone a better experience, but it requires patience, it requires time, and it requires a lot of conversation between teams. if you're good at this, if you do this really well, no one will notice it. That's the goal, is that no one notices this sort of experience, that it just kind of comes in the background. But that's what being a craftsman is. You only notice the people who do shoddy work. You only notice when something's really broken. With any luck, no one will know you're even there if you do all this right. Here's some contact information, my Twitter handle, a link to my book if you guys are interested in reading more about responsive design. I cover a number of topics. I go into depth with Modernizr a little bit more. Also cover media queries and some of my workflows and processes in there. And bigspaceship.com if you guys are ever in the mood to check out blogs and stuff we post on there. I normally would put my site up there, but it's like 2 years old and I haven't touched it since. Thanks a lot, and I'll go ahead and open up to questions and answer if anyone has any questions. Yep, Nathan? Right, so he's asking if YepNope can identify the file name by default, right? Yeah, it appends according to the file type. So you can assign an array of files, and it splits it at the dot and tells you can tell which file or how to appropriate the file. And it loads it all asynchronously after the initial DOM load, so it just appends to the bottom of the page like anything else would. Thanks a lot. I think lunch is ready, and I just bought you guys a half an hour, so that's awesome.